But tonight we'll have a very different topic.
Yes, right.
Yes. So I'm not going to steal that thunder. I'll let you talk about it. But last night we noted that there is diversity among us, and we talked about some of the multi-generational families, but there are actually several different congregations represented here tonight. Of course, Cochran Chapel United Methodist, our friends from Walnut Hill Church join us again. We're glad for that. Ted and Dale frequently worship at Lover's Lane.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Right. Brenda often, First Richardson, Carol comes from First Richardson. Brenda often worships at Lover's Lane or White Rock Church. So, yeah. And Tom is our honorary non-Methodist, right? Tom, yes. Tom comes from the Church of Christ tradition. Is that right? Yeah.
We should sing an a cappella song here, you know?
We should. Make Tom feel at home.
Yeah.
Good. But great fun tonight. So the question asked most often this evening is, what's for dessert tonight? Yeah. It's an excellent question. We will be having coffee and cookies from Union Coffee. And just before we got underway this evening, I was in a meeting with Katie Newsom, the pastor at Union Coffee, because we're talking about hosting their location here at Cochran Chapel. So we continue to talk about ways to be engaged in fruitful and creative forms of ministries so that we might make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So they will come, and as we did last night, talk a little bit about Union Coffee and what they're up to, and then we're going to caffeinate you right before you go home to bed. Right? Doesn't that sound good? Hopefully they brought their decaf.
Yeah,
if not, we'll pull out a few of our own packets. But yeah, so that's to look forward to. In the interval tonight, we will be assembling snack kits for kids who are homeless. They are involved in the Dallas Independent School District's homeless education program. So very much like last night, many items will be one each, but there are a few items where there is more than one, so just look on the tables. We won't be packing boxes tonight. We will be packing Ziploc bags. So, but exactly the same process, and once we're finished, then we get to have dessert. So I didn't have a formal introduction tonight, so just one question.
Okay.
How many times, not counting your study in Oxford, have you been to England?
Oh gosh, yeah, probably.
Has Dale kept track?
Probably 15 or 20 times, I would guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, because I went to Oxford Institutes and I've led tours and that sort of thing, so yeah.
Oh, good. So inherent in the answer was the answer for which I was looking, which is, do you lead the standard John Wesley tour?
Yeah, we do, and there's a new way of doing it too, but we like to do it with students from the School of Theology so they can see all the John Wesley stuff they're going to be talking about and the British Methodist stuff, but we also invite lay people to join us on these tours, and it's fun because we know some secret places that not everybody gets to see and so forth. So,
all right. Well, we may have to talk about organizing a John Wesley tour.
Like where Charles Wesley is buried.
Oh,
they've been moving him
Church.
around. Yeah.
Well, there is always construction on Marylebone Road.
Yes,
but,
well,
yeah,
right.
Poor Charles.
And, he's just off of Marylebone Road, but they wanted to make a new car park, and they said, they had all kinds of, you'll get a kick out of this, Jeff. All the Methodists were saying, well, let's get the Anglican bishops to consecrate Wesley's chapel, and then we can put Charles back together with John. And somebody pointed out, after all these ideas came up, Charles Wesley actually has descendants. John Wesley didn't have any descendants, but Charles Wesley had family, and they're a family in London who have the name Wesley, and they're Charles Wesley. And so they asked the kids, and they said, frankly, we don't care where you put the old guy. So, so they built the car park, but it's very nice. They built a little garden, and it's a pleasant little place they have.
Good.
But you don't get that on the standard tours. You come my tour, you get that.
All right. So if we'll have to talk at the end of VBS for Adults about who wants to go to England, and we may be able to recruit our very own tour guide, which would be tremendous. But tonight's tour guide through issues of sexuality in the United Methodist Church is our very own Ted Campbell.
All right, here we go. So, thank you. It's great to be here with y'all. I do think of this as the original Christian church in the Dallas area. It's the oldest, January 1944. Nobody else can beat that, even the Baptists, and they would like to, but they can't. So, so we are talking about interpreting 3 challenges for the United Methodist Church, and I'm trying to do this as a storyteller, but it's complicated stories. Some of us were talking at lunch, at dinner this evening about writing, and we were quoting, I was quoting Maya Angelou, who says, you know what the cure for writer's block is? You write. You just write. You just sit yourself down and you start writing. And even if it's trash, you still, it's going to help you one way or another. You're going to eventually get beyond it and so forth. But in any case, I'm a storyteller, and I like to work that out in my writing. I've been working on some of that today on my history of my native Southeast Texas. But tonight I'm going to do it with another challenge to the United Methodist Church. Last night we talked about the challenge of membership decline and generational changes in the United Methodist Church, and that really was a myth-buster kind of thing. I think we let people paint us into a circle, and honest to goodness, I've written this in a book, that if press people were to come to a traditional church now, one of the old line churches like we are, I think they would be shocked to see that there are people here, because the image that we have out there is that there's nothing but a bunch of shriveled up old people who are just, next week they're going to die and there won't be any more Methodists or Presbyterians and so on and so forth. It's just a remarkably consistent impression that people have. Tonight I'm going to talk about biblical authority and the challenge of sexuality in the United Methodist Church. That's the issue that has divided us now in the last few years. And then tomorrow night I'm going to talk about an emerging challenge that we're just beginning to work through. You could call it a challenge of Catholicity in the broad sense of Catholic meaning for the whole world. But how are we going to be a church that's no longer a majority American church? How are we going to work with people throughout the world who are united, not just Methodist, but United Methodist, part of our own denominational family? So tonight I want to talk about this matter of sexuality and what it's meant for our church. I'm a storyteller. I want to tell complicated stories about real people and institutions, even stories that are happening right now. That's always dangerous. The best advice you can give to a historian is write about dead people, because living people can come back and contradict you. It's so embarrassing. And so that's where I'm putting myself on the line a little bit here. But yeah, I want to tell these kind of complicated stories with responsibility to historical evidence, and with fairness to those people who are engaged in these stories, because we need to do this, to tell responsible and interesting stories that illuminate our current reality. And Christians have a rather deeply problematic history of misrepresenting other Christian groups. Liberals represent conservative Christians in certain ways and vice versa, and Catholics represent Protestants, and Protestants represent Catholics, and all kinds of stuff. Even in our articles of religion, we say things about Catholics that are simply false, and we know it. We've had a resolution that says we don't really mean that, but we don't change the articles of religion. So it's problematic, and this is one of those areas. The big challenge is biblical authority and the challenge of sexuality for the United Methodist Church, and in particular homosexuality. Just to be specific, people say, well, don't you want to talk about LGBTQ+ and so on and so forth? Maybe, but that's not who we've been talking about. The issue for the United Methodist Church has been very specific words about people who have same-sex attraction, and that's been the issue over which we have really divided. in a sense, it's difficult to tell because this is a matter of what happened yesterday. This is trying to tell a story about what just happened, and all the people in it, well, most of them are alive, right? And they can contradict what I say about this. So I'm not trying to please everybody. I've got an angle on this, and I'll let you know what that is. But different groups told this story in different ways. Most of the time, the story was being told by partisans, and they were trying to tell the story to tell you why the other people are wrong. And on both sides, or all sides, or 3 sides, or 9 sides, or how many sides we've got in this. That's why history is passionately engaging, at least for me, because the question is not what happened back then. The question is who we are. The question is our identity. United Methodist history, when I teach that, the big deal is who is the United Methodist Church? That's what we're really talking about. One of the things that happened in my lifetime was a man named Alex Haley came out with a book called Roots, the Story of an American Family, and then it was televised. And that was amazing, you see, because it wasn't just saying this happened and then this happened and this happened. It's saying this is who we are as African-American people. That's what he was, this is what the complicated reality that is black life in the United States. And I remember, you know, we had Sunday evening church, remember that? And we come home from Sunday evening church and watch those episodes of Roots. One evening we went over to Dale's parents' house, and Dale's staunch German grandfather was watching your father, her father, and it's the evening when they bury Toby, who was really Kunta Kinte, and it shows this scene where the daughter goes down there and she scratches out the name Toby and she writes Kunta Kinte, and Dale's dad's face was streaming at that point. He, you know, it was like, okay, I get this, man. And that's why I think it's important. We're trying to talk about who we are as a church, and talking about it in the present, you know, in a matter like this that's just been happening is kind of tough. It's almost always tied to positions about the issues, and I'm not an innocent bystander. I've got positions on this. So let's go way, way, way back and talk about Jesus and the Bible and so forth, because there's a lot of sex in the Bible. And really, it's, somebody has said, you know, the most boring passages in the Bible are such beget such, beget such, beget such, you know, all those passages. Well, what if some Bible teachers say, you need to just envision exactly what that concretely means. Well, that's fun, okay? Begetting, I mean, that's, you know, that's sex, right? I mean, that's you don't get it many other ways than that. So I'm going to say a few things that might be controversial, but I'm a historian, and I think I can at least tell you why I would say this. Jesus set an example of singleness, a dedicated single life, not ever married. Now, Protestants have a problem with that, right? I drive around Dallas and I see Christian Family Church. And so what if you're a single person? What does that sign say? Like Jesus, you know? What if you're called to be a single person, like many teachers have been in the past, called to be single people? Jesus set an example of singleness. St. Paul warned against marriage. Look at 1 Corinthians 7. Yes, he said, it is better to marry than to burn. And people used to think that meant burn in hell or something like that. And the nicer liberal translations now say better to marry than to burn with lust or something like that. That's nice, but he wasn't really enthusiastic about a Christian family church, right? I mean, he really, and I think Paul thought the end of time was going to come, and maybe you just don't need to mess around getting married and stuff like that. But early Christians allowed marriages. That's about the best you can say. Part of our debate has been, my colleague Billy Abraham, whom I deeply respected. But Billy said, what are you going to do? You're going to do away with 2,000 years of Christian marriage. And I had to say, Billy, there haven't been 2,000 years of Christian marriage. Christians did not perform marriages until probably the 300s AD, the 4th century AD. Christians accepted people who had civil marriages or marriages that were simply family agreements. Really, that's the way marriages used to be done. The family just arranged who was going to marry whom and so forth, and the kids might get some degree of a say in the matter, but that's the way it worked. So Christians did not begin blessing marriages until about the 300s AD, and even then, it was like at the end of a Mass or at the end of a communion service when the priest would bless the two people who were being married. But the real deal was legal. It was a legal thing that was actually happening. And in many cases, even into the Middle Ages, marriages were not performed in churches. It was considered an inappropriate thing to do in church. You did it outside the doors of the church, something like that. So the history of marriage in Christianity is a little more complicated than Protestants might imagine it being. St. Paul appears to have condemned same-sex relationships. There are several passages in Paul's letters, specifically in Romans chapter 2 and at the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2, and in 1 Corinthians that seem to be condemning same-sex attraction, though the meaning of these passages has been hugely challenged. This was one of the great contributions of my elder faculty member at Perkins School of Theology, Victor Furnish. And what I never knew is that Vic Furnish had a sister named Dorothy Jean. They called her DJ Furnish. And she taught at Garrett for decades. And I was president of Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. And Dorothy Jean Furnish was just a beloved teacher to students. She taught Christian education. And she was gay. And she was gay at a time when nobody could come out and say that, especially if you were in a Methodist church. But Vic knew that. And so it tended to challenge him thinking about what Paul wrote. He was a great scholar of Pauline studies, and he knew about these problematic challenges. I don't know if you know, but some people call these the clobber passages. The passages you can use to clobber gay people and say, this is not right. But that's part of it. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it appears that Paul condemned same-sex relationships. Eastern and Western churches both came to regard both marriage and commitments to single life not only as acceptable, but also as a formally blessed lifetime commitment. So for Catholics, there's 7 sacraments, and yet most people only get 6 in their lifetime because either you choose marriage or you choose singleness. That's the option that you have. There are people who have managed to do all 7. Like if a man's wife dies, then he actually then is eligible to become a priest, and that's happened before. But for Catholic and Orthodox churches, these older Christian churches, both marriage and single life were not just acceptable, but they were all blessed formally by churches. Catholic churches eventually came to require singleness of clergy in the Middle Ages. But if you want to see the evidence against that, go up Inwood Road to St. Monica's and see Father Jeff. No, not Father Jeff. You're Father Jeff, weren't you? No, Father Josh Whitfield. He writes in the Dallas Morning News from time to time, and he'll preach a homily at Mass about his kids and talk about them. He's a married guy, and the Catholic Church actually made a special deal that said people who were Anglican priests could go through a certain process and become Catholic priests. So the Catholic Church isn't fundamentally opposed to married priests. It's just a very rare thing in their way of doing it. Protestantism, this is the part that's not going to surprise you at all. Protestant church traditions emerged in the 16th century, the 1500s, with a strong emphasis on biblical authority, especially in matters related to salvation. But I'm going to nuance that. Here's where I'm going to do the Mythbusters thing about Protestants and biblical authority. But especially in matters related to salvation. In fact, that's what Protestants put the emphasis on. They rejected the requirement of clergy celibacy. They affirmed clergy marriages. And they actually did away with any formal structures supporting single life, monastic houses. Now, what I know as a historian is that that had a devastating effect on European countries like England. What it meant was that when the monasteries were done away with, almost everything that we would call a social service was done away with. There were no more hospitals, there were no more orphanages, there were no more homes for poor people, and so all of that was done away with. And these Protestant countries had to sort of put together those kinds of social services piecemeal, but not tied to Christian conviction, to Christian life. So the doing away with structures for single life, Protestants always said, yeah, okay, if you want to, you can be single. But I mean, I used to be part of a scholarship group, and I was the chair of the scholarship committee, and the truth was, anytime we had a man who was 25 years old or older and he hadn't got married, some of the old guys had real problems with this, okay? You know, you just, the expectation is you'd be married. Protestant churches basically emphasized marriage and did away with the structures for single life. Now, it's going to be relevant when I come to talk about John Wesley, because this is one of the issues for him. Heterosexual marriage was the only form of sexual relationship, sexual activity that was formally and liturgically sanctioned. Liturgically, I mean sanctioned in worship by Protestant church communities. Though it's an interesting fact that the most central doctrinal statements of the early Protestant churches never explicitly condemn same-sex relationships. It's just an interesting thing. You know, the conservatives on this matter can say, well, nobody was even doing something like that. Well, I don't think so. I think that sort of thing was happening at that time, but it wasn't talked about. That's true. There was a strong folk culture of kind of revulsion to same-sex relationships, and especially to same-sex male relationships. But nevertheless, it's never been part of like the Lutheran Augsburg Confession, the Presbyterian Westminster Confession, the Anglican Articles of Religion or Catechism. It's just not said, okay? It's an interesting silence on that in early Protestant churches. So John Wesley, how much time do we have?
All the time in the world.
No, yeah, watch out. He said all the time in the world. No, this is my area of study and specialty. I've just had an article published called John Wesley and Celibacy, and it's about his commitments to single life and how he broke it and then how he returned to it. It was published in the Journal of Ecclesiastical History. That's a Cambridge University journal. But he felt a calling to single life. He struggled, as people who feel a calling to single life will do. He struggled with his attraction to women, including a young woman named Sophia Hopke in Georgia. And we've got some stuff that's only been published in recent years that may change your image about John Wesley. I mean, he was in like with her. I mean, he liked her a lot. But then they went on a trip down the Georgia coast while he was in Georgia serving as priest of this Anglican congregation. And it was the two of them and a crew of sailors. But if you can imagine this, in Georgia, it's just raining cats and dogs every night, every day for a week. And so what they have to do is there's no ports between Charleston, where they started out, and St. Simon's Island, where they're going to end up. So they just pull into an uninhabited island near the shore, and they take the ship's sail and put it down on the ground with a few pegs, and the ship's crew sleep over here on this side, and John is put to sleep with his friend who happened to be a girl, okay, right? And John Wesley says in his diary that he never published, this has just come out in print in recent years, he said, God saved us from the great sin despite all of my inclinations elsewise. But then he has this Latin quotation from St. Augustine, and the Latin quotation says, but isn't the very act of kissing and hugging and touching another person, isn't that sinful in itself? And so you can tell what he's thinking about. He's struggling with that, but he has this sense that he ought to remain a single man. He advised against marriage. He thought it was going to detract you from the Christian life. He wrote a treatise called Thoughts Upon Marriage and a Single Life, and his advice to men is don't do it. It's going to distract you from focusing all your attention on God. And then he got married. And people were just dumbfounded after all this stuff about being single and how great it was. Why did he get married? Well, John had a kind of not quite convincing reason for this. He said, well, I'll be stronger in my ministry if I'm seen as a man who has a wife and so on and so forth. He married a widow who was a little bit older than he was. She had been married to a very wealthy French merchant in London, and they lived on the very street where the Bank of London is located, right? They had a house with she had a house with servants. Her husband had died and so forth, and he just up and marries her, and it's just shocking. Charles Wesley says it's just the weirdest thing. He says, I grieved from morning to evening for 3 days. Charles was a bit of a drama queen himself, but he just can't imagine. He just thought John's singleness was really what John was cut out to do. And eventually John is going to perform Charles's wedding, and they're going to patch things up and get back together. But he marries Mary Nagoldhawk-Vazeille in 1751. But he kept his own rooms at the ministry center he called the Foundry, including bedrooms. And some of the times he could stay with Mary, and some of the times he could just go on to his own place. Mary was in charge of the household, that's very clear. He was in charge of his movement. On top of that, he traveled about half of every year. He would leave in the spring and go up to Bristol, and then in the summer he would go up to Newcastle upon Tyne, and in the end of the year he would come back to London in the fall, and he's just away. She didn't want to travel with him. She tried it at first. It just didn't work. So he was living effectively as a single man most of the time, even when he was married, and then their marriage fell apart. And all Methodists historically have said terrible things about Mary. Most of them are simply anecdotal. But the truth is, Mary was a dedicated Methodist, and even after they effectively separate, they never divorced, they just separated. People knew they didn't get along with each other. Mary kept going over to the Foundry and working. She was the head of the book printing enterprise that was one of the main things that Methodists were doing. Not only printing John's books, but printing Charles Wesley's books of hymns and stuff like that. She's a very gifted woman. The day that she was buried, John Wesley came into London. Nobody told him that she had died and that she was being buried that day. And he says, it was Friday he came into London when she was buried. And it's not until Monday that somebody actually tells him that she had died and was already buried. Very sad. And he writes this in his journal. He's very honest about this. But she's lying there at St. Giles, Camberwell, this beautiful Anglican church, and there is no marker for her. And I really think someday I'm going to start a little, what do you call that online, where you try to get people to give you money? GoFundMe or something like that to get at least a little monument at St. Giles, Camberwell for Mary. He never divorced, he separated, and then he continued right back to his single life. He was just cut out for a single life, and he kind of perceived that very early on. As a religious movement, Methodists were not a church. Methodist ministers did not perform marriages, but he did recognize leadership roles for women. In fact, very strong leadership roles for women. By the 1760s, he encouraged women to become what they called exhorters. You know, at old-fashioned revivals like they used to have in the frontier times, and even in the through the 1800s and all, Methodists would have these summer get-togethers, these camp meetings, right? And one of the things they would do is they'd have the great preacher who would get up and preach for about an hour or so. This doesn't sound like fun to me, but they would preach for an hour or so. And then they'd have somebody come up at the end and sort of, well, they're kind of the closer of the deal, you know, and they're going to say, now, Brother Hall has just given us a wonderful sermon this evening on the need to repent, and don't you feel, they're the one that sort of brings it to a close and says, now as every head is bowed and as every eye is closed, I want to see those hands of everyone in this auditorium this evening who's going to give their hearts to Jesus. Praise God. I see hands are going. They're actually not, Jeff, but you know, that person is called the exhorter. And you became an exhorter first, and then you became a preacher. Methodists didn't have ministers, they just had preachers who were authorized to preach. And the exhorters was the same. Well, they made women exhorters from the 1760s, and then in the 1770s, he allowed women to be ministers, not to be ministers, to be preachers, right? Formally installed them, part of the circuits and so forth. So remarkable. Early Methodists avoided any suggestion of sexual impropriety. You avoid even the appearance that you might be doing something inappropriate, including avoiding dancing. You always thought that was a Baptist thing. Well, that was a Methodist thing as well as a Baptist thing. My parents talked about in the 1940s at their little church in Beaumont, they did these exercises in a auditorium or a hall like that where they had some music going. And imagine this, it's 8 people and there's man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, man, woman. And somebody is calling out things to do like do-si-do your partner or Alaman left. No, absolutely not. That was called folk games. Because Methodists didn't dance, right? And so this was a big deal for Methodists. I mean, you can make the case dancing is, among other things, lovely, but it's a socially allowed way to touch somebody's body, isn't it? And people need to learn how to touch other people's bodies appropriately. But I think that's why it was such a controversial thing. So they did not make this explicit, but they presumed that same-sex relationships were inappropriate, reflecting that long European folk culture that regarded them as inappropriate and probably as abnormal as they saw it in those times. But that was never explicit, interestingly. Until 1972, there was never a word about homosexuality in Methodist books, and that was true for most Protestants as well. Methodist churches, like other Protestant churches, formally sanctioned only heterosexual marriages. That was written into the prayer book. Do you such and such take this man? Do you such and such take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife? And so forth. Despite the fact of heroic single Methodists like Bishop Francis Asbury. An evangelical Christian who is a very good historian has written a new up-to-date biography of Francis Asbury, and it's called American Saint. He just thinks he was St. Francis Asbury, really. It's a remarkable story. Methodist people probably shared traditional cultures of revulsion to same-sex relationships, But Methodist churches did not formally condemn them, as I say, until 1972. Well, I'm going to get to that, but I want to jump back a little bit and say, meanwhile, contemporary medical and scientific views were beginning to change about same-sex relationships. Contemporary scientific and medical evidence since the 1960s, maybe the 1950s, you know, the Kinsey report and so forth, were beginning to treat same-sex homosexual attraction not as a neurotic or deviant practice that needed to be cured, but as one way that people can sort of live with each other in modern life. American Psychiatric Association, the APA's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Anytime you go to a counselor, which I have done and I recommend it, you'll see on their wall the DSM, okay? DSM 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now it's like 7 or 8 or something, like gets bigger all the time. But in 1974, it's interesting, it's 2 years after the Methodists first said something critical about homosexuality, the American Psychiatric Association's beginning to say, you know, I don't think we don't think that's something that needs to be cured, although you do have to deal with the problems that homosexual couples face. Then beyond just the scientific issue, there was just the growing social acceptance of same-sex relationships and marriages from around the 1990s or so. Well, Dale and I could tell the difference. Our daughters have never had any time in which they did not know gay people. That's just part of their life. It's just ordinary. It was not shocking to them and so forth, but that was not the way life was when we were young. So really, it's not so much the scientific literature that I think convinces people about this, but it's familiarity and friendship as gay people come out and people begin to understand that they never intended to be homosexual. If you meet gay people, one of the things they will tell you is, I did not want to be gay. I would prefer to be heterosexual because life would be so much easier for me, but I am gay. And you can talk to people whose children are gay, and they will tell you, we knew since he was 5 years old that he was gay, that it was just very clear to them. So it's what one writer has called proximity, being close to people that tends to change people's minds about that. I have to say, that's true. Through a lot of my career, my 40-year career as teaching, I regarded gay life as being sort of wrong, just not appropriate at all. But I had students who would come to me and confide and talk to me. And the interesting thing was, they didn't live up to my stereotypes, and that kind of disappointed me. I thought it was supposed to be Democrats and liberal Protestants who were gay, but I've got a student, you know, who'll come to my office and he'll say, I'm Pentecostal. Jesus has called me to be a Pentecostal preacher and help people speak in tongues and all that kind of stuff, but I'm queer, he says, you know, and that's it, and he's just very clear. I would rather not be, but that's who I am. And I thought, that doesn't meet my stereotype, okay? And it seems to cut across political inclinations and so forth. That was one thing that began to change my sort of thinking about the matters of homosexuality in relationship to the church. At about the same time, this is some of the work of historians, is that historians began to describe a long history of prominent religious as well as civic leaders who were in same-sex relationships. Famous Methodist leader Francis Willard. Y'all probably don't know about Francis Willard, but every state, you know, has 2 busts in the statuary gallery, in 2 statues of the 2 greatest people from their state. And for the state of Illinois, it's Abraham Lincoln and Francis Willard. Francis Willard was this great Methodist anti-alcohol crusader. make the world better by doing away with all alcohol. She was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and in fact, she attended the church that Dale and I attended in Evanston, Illinois, and her little Victorian gingerbread house was right down the street and is the national headquarters remaining of the WCTU. And in fact, she lived there with a female companion almost all of her adult life. And it's interesting, that was not considered to be a problem. It's very interesting. In Victorian and early 20th century culture, male-to-male relationships were much more feared than female-to-female relationship. There's reasons for that, but we don't talk about them in Methodist circles. But it's an interesting thing. You could have what they called a Boston marriage, where two women would just live together and support each other, and nobody's asking questions about what they do at night and so forth. It's just, that didn't work for men. And in fact, Georgia Harkness, great Methodist theologian, the darling of Methodist women's groups at the middle of the 20th century. Georgia Harkness lived with a female companion. She was a theologian at Garrett. And again, she sort of went to the same church that we went to there, and we know that story very, very well. So the problematic thing is we know there have been a lot of gay men in ministry, in church life in the United Methodist Church. I can name some gay saints to you who just were wonderful people. But men tended to have a more problematic time with it. In this case, there's a gender difference, and somehow, if it was okay for women to live together, it was not okay for men to be together and sleep together and so forth. So there are some abusive cases of men who were clergy and were gay, and the ways they had to find to express that were really not appropriate. So you have to say that it's a very interesting sort of thing. All that comes down to the 2015 United States Supreme Court decision affirming same-sex marriages. Where was I, Jeff, when I heard that news break? I was in Wilmore, Kentucky, and Jeff knows what that means. Wilmore, Kentucky is the center of one of the most conservative and traditional Methodist theological schools in the whole world. And I decided to go to the Episcopal Church that Sunday. I wasn't going to deal with that particular Sunday. So what does this mean for our churches? Well, there has been a growing conservative reaction to the modern normalization of same-sex relationships. Conservative Christians, Protestant and Catholics, reacted very negatively to scientific claims, specifically on the basis of the traditional sort of clobber passages in the Bible that appear to condemn same-sex relationships. And you can look them up in Leviticus, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, Jude, if that really is one at all, and Romans chapter 1, and I think going into chapter 2 there. But biblical scholarship begins to raise questions about what that really meant. Was it talking about cult prostitution? Was it talking about other kinds of abuse than simply two people of the same gender having sexual relations? Catholic and Orthodox Christians also objected to the scientific claims on the basis of Christian traditions, where there had been traditions, even though not in the great confessions of the churches, condemning same-sex relationships. And Protestant conservatives base this on their view of the Bible, which is that every verse of the Bible, every part of it ought to be enacted legislatively and literally in every church everywhere. So if they were true to that, well, Paul says, this is my rule in all the churches, he says, let your women keep silence in church. So we should not, Jeff, you should not allow women to sing in church, all right? Only men would be able to sing and so forth, if you're going to follow it literally. They don't, okay? I know that. There are certain things that they follow and certain things that they don't follow. But they would sometimes say, if you were really true to John Wesley, you know, he believed everything about the Bible. So I'm going to issue a kind of challenge on that point. But before I do, I'm going to say how we got to this point as Methodists. We have something called the social creed. The social creed came up in the early 20th century I think I mentioned yesterday the social gospel movement, when these Baptist and Lutheran pastors in New York City began saying, look, we've got a crisis on our streets here. We can't preach to save these people's souls without helping their bodies as well. And that becomes a major thing for the older Protestant churches in the United States. And so Methodists got involved in that. And the Methodists a group of Methodists developed something they called the Social Creed. And in 1908, they convinced the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church to adopt this Social Creed. It's very forward-looking. It calls for paying attention to sweatshops and looking at all. And the interesting thing to me is all the other denominations approved it, or approved versions of it, including my Southern Methodist great-great-great-grandparents. The Southern Methodist Church actually approved that. The South wasn't very urbanized at that time, and I think they were thinking, these are these Yankees' problems, but we'll support them by, approving this thing, something like that. But that's one of the steps along the way, and our social principles began to develop. Dale and I knew a member of the Maryland legislature who carried the Methodist social principles in her purse. She was adamantly anti-gambling. She was progressive on almost every other issue, but boy, Jenny, you sit her down and she'd look up what it says in the Methodist social principles. She sort of followed that. In 1972, that date is wrong, the General Conference received a revised proposal for our social principles that included an acknowledgement that, and I quote, homosexual persons are persons of sacred worth who need the ministries of the church. But when that came to the General Conference that met in Atlanta, a delegate from San Antonio, Texas, who we have talked to, we've got sort of interviews with him to talk about why he did it, but he proposed that we add to that, though we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. Now that was there, and it was never changed until the year 2024, okay? That was in every Methodist discipline from that point, but that was the first time Methodists said anything on that subject. So every conference after 1972 had motions to remove those condemnations from the 1972 discipline, and they failed, and they failed, and they failed. And they usually failed by a vote of about 2/3 of the conference would vote against changing that, so in favor of keeping it, and about 1/3 of the General Conference would vote to change it, to try to switch that. Press reports in this period came to focus on the United Methodist Church almost exclusively with respect to this issue. We got so tired of it, it was like some memo went out to the Associated Press that said, the United Methodist Church is an organization that meets once every 4 years to argue about homosexual people. And you are to only write about that, and what we want to see is blood, guts, and gore, and conflict and division. That's the essence of great reporting, so give it to us. There probably never was something like that, but that's all that we got reported about. And that was kind of embarrassing to everyone in the church, just to say, is that the only thing we're worried about? All attempts to revise the condemnatory language from 1976 through 2016, through 2016 and on to 2019 failed. So there's a growing sense by the early 2000s that everyone was tired of arguing about this, of thinking this is what our church, can we get back to forming congregations and so forth and just find a way to live together? And what we discovered the answer to that was no, we can't. We just could not find a way to live together. 2016 General Conference appointed a commission to find a way forward. And you know what they found? 3 ways forward. And none of those prevailed, so it was clear even in the committee work they were not able to find a way to alter this and so forth. They called a special general conference in 2019 to deal only with this issue. But they again refused to alter any of that language in the discipline, and yet by a very, very tiny margin there. I mean, about 18 votes one way or the other would have shifted it. And so what happens is that they also, in 2019, put in place a provision that congregations could disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church without losing their church property. But, you know, as United Methodist, you can all go join another church. There's no problem with that. You just can't take the church property with you. That's always been one of the sort of foundational thing. But it was back in the days when a Methodist church building was kind of like a barn. And if it burnt down, well, in the next month, you'd have to have a kind of church raising and put a new church together. But the more people got attached to their churches, or attached to their church buildings, that became more and more of a problem. So what happened is that after 2019, as soon as COVID hit, I mean, it was just like wham, wham, groups began to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church. By the end of 2024, about 1/4 of all United Methodist congregations in the United States and 1/4 of the clergy had become part of some other denomination. The largest other group is called the Global Methodist Church. My friend Scott Jones has become a bishop. He was a bishop of my conference. He became a bishop in that church. The bishops had a large role to play in this. In my conference, which is used to be the largest by far in Texas, we call it the Texas Annual Conference. That's problematic because it's not for the whole state. But in our conference, we lost half of the congregations, half of the members, half of the clergy over this one issue. Now, here in North Texas, y'all did not do so poorly at all. I mean, I think maybe 14, 15 churches in the end disaffiliated from the denomination. But not globally, United States, it was about 25% of all the churches. So, and the truth is that the bishop here in this conference was not in favor of the disaffiliations and made it more difficult. I think the bishop in our conference really sort of favored it and thought it's time to have an amicable division, and he helped that happen. So COVID-19 had an interesting implication because, you know, to have a Methodist General Conference, you have to have a room where you put about 900 people together for a week or two. And in COVID, that was a big problem. And they said, okay, let's just have a virtual General Conference where we're all online, an online General Conference. And it went to our kind of Supreme Court in the United Methodist Church, and they said, no, the wording of the discipline is it has to be an in-person meeting, and you've got to fly people in from Africa and the Philippines and all over the world, and that wasn't going to work. So that meant from 2019 through 2014, for 5 years, there was no meeting of any United Methodist General Conference at all, and by that time, things had already sort of gone their own way. So I want to go back for a minute and talk about Protestant definitions of biblical authority, because there is a difference. I hinted at this last night between kind of evangelical churches that are historically newer churches and the older, more historic Protestant churches in the United States. And one of the differences is that the older churches define biblical authority in a very particular way. You know, people haven't paid attention to this, so if you haven't seen the Methodist Articles of Religion, I'm going to show you our Article of Religion on the authority of Scripture. The Holy Scriptures contain all things necessary to salvation. That was the issue in the 1500s when Luther and the Anglicans began framing all this stuff. So that whatsoever is not read therein, nor may be proved thereby, is not to be required of any man that it should be believed as an article of faith or be thought requisite or necessary to salvation. In the name of the Holy Scripture, we do understand those canonical books of the Old and New Testament of whose authority was never any doubt in the church. And they give you the list of all the Old Testament books there. We also have a doctrinal standard that came from the Evangelical United Brethren Church. It's called our Confession of Faith. It's equally authoritative for United Methodists. And it says, we believe the Holy Bible, Old and New Testaments, reveals the Word of God so far as it is necessary for our salvation. It is to be received through the Holy Spirit as the true rule and guide for faith and practice. Whatever is not revealed in or established by the Holy Scriptures is not to be made an article of faith, nor is it to be taught as essential to salvation. Now, you may be wondering, okay, so what's the deal here? Well, what's the deal here is that it really says the Scriptures have authority for matters of salvation. Very, very consistently. Protestants were the leaders in scientific research and scientific development from the time of the Protestant Reformation really through the 1800s, because, you know, we didn't think that to know whether the sun goes around the earth or the earth goes around the sun, it just never occurred to Protestants to look in the Bible and see what it said about that. We're going to look in a telescope, we're going to look in a microscope to find amoebae and cells and stuff and learn about the physical universe. So Protestants' views of Scripture did not say the Scriptures contain all things necessary for science, technology, medical practice, and so forth. And that left Protestants generally free to follow scientific, medical, and so forth. That, I think, really became the big divide in American Protestantism. The evangelical or fundamentalist churches wanted to say no to this, that the Scriptures do contain everything necessary for science and history and technology. And Protestants have had this more limited view of the authority of Scripture. So this conference that met in 2024, I'm coming to the end now, you'll be pleased to know, I think, it removed the restrictive language against same-sex relationships. That's just in the last year that happened. It defined marriage as being between two partners who make a Christian profession and a lifetime commitment to each other. We're not letting people write their own vows, right? We don't do that. You have to make a profession of Christian faith, both of you, and you have to make a permanent lifetime commitment. We're not messing around, as the popular term is. Made it clear that clergy are not required to perform any marriages. That's always been the case, right? I, as a clergy person, have the right to perform a marriage if I deem that to be appropriate. And there are cases where I would have to say no. I should have one time. Dale knows I've got one very embarrassing case where I had a man and a woman who came to me at Highland Park, and they said, we'd like you to perform our marriage, and they sent them to me, and I asked them all the usual questions. I asked her, have you ever been married before? And she said no. And I asked him, have you ever been married before? And he said yes. And I talked to him for a while. Have you worked through this and so forth? And then we get to one of these hotels out by the airport for the actual service. There was a follow-up question I was supposed to ask him, and I didn't. How many times? And I'm going to quote this, but his son says to me just before we walk into the service, shit, man, you believe my old man getting married for the fourth time? No! But if I'd known, I should have asked that question, you know. But clergy are not required. I mean, a clergy person, look, we've still got people in the United Methodist Church who think homosexuality is not appropriate, right? And we've got clergy who do. I predicted that, by the way. And there are people in the Global Methodist Church who think we should be more open to gay people. Then you say, well, why do they? Well, that's not the only issue in church life, right? You go, in many cases, where your friends are. You go where your family is. You go where you feel you're most needed in ministry. So these kinds of issues don't determine everything. And so clergy are free, basically, to accept or not accept the opportunity to perform a same-sex marriage. It gave congregations the right to determine if they would allow same-sex relationships to be solemnized in their church. That seems to have been challenged by a more recent judicial council ruling but I'm not sure how that one's actually going to come out, so we will see. Are we there yet? Well, I can say one thing. Our church meetings feel a lot better now. Boy, Jeff can tell you, anyone who's gone to Methodist meetings up to about 3 years ago, to 2023, I would say, they were just a mess and just nasty, and yeah, you just wouldn't want to be part of it. God told me a long time ago never to go to another general conference. I went to two. I'm a writer. I can do my thing, okay, but not that. But church meetings feel a lot better now. They've just been so much more positive. And I understand that's true with the disaffiliated groups as well. They feel much better about this now. People have opinions and options, and they've used those options. People feel in general that the process that we used was fair. But I would have to say, sadly enough, a well of bitterness and anger remains. Friendships have been broken, and we also experience that. And I wince at that sort of thing, but I have to say it's true. I've said it's going to take 2 or 3 generations of pissed off old people to die off on all sides before we can ever kind of get back together again. But are we there yet? Well, we've basically come to a fairly strong conclusion on that set of issues, and we're still working on some other issues. So I've kept you probably longer than we should have gone tonight, and you've got to go wrap up some food for people. But any questions that yeah?
So I'm in the interesting in-between generation.
Okay.
Growing up, I didn't know any gay people.
Yes.
Until I got to college.
You probably did know some gay people. You did not know they were gay, right?
No.
Yeah.
No,
Okay. Until you were in college. Okay. Right. Your X generation.
And then one of my friends got excommunicated, which I didn't think was possible, from a Baptist church.
Oh yes, that's. I can assure you that's possible. Yeah.
Well, having grown up Southern Baptist, I've not seen it.
Yep.
So,
Well, right.
Didn't
Okay.
realize
Fair
it was
enough.
an option.
Yep.
And so I asked him why, and he said because they had called him up in front of the church and asked him to renounce being gay, or they would kick him out.
Yep.
And he said, I didn't pick being gay any more than I picked my icon.
Yeah.
And I said, oh.
Okay.
And so that was my first kind of more like your daughter, where
Yeah.
your daughters, where they have always
And they've known gay friends who have been out about being gay since they were in junior high school, probably. So yeah. Yeah.
And then one of my best coworkers, I thought, oh, well, this is great. He's single. My friend's friend is single. I'll put them together. And his office mate came to me and said, no.
And they said what?
They said no.
Oh, you can't do that. Okay, I see. Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
So we got to have that kind of awkward conversation.
Yep.
I was like, so are you? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, okay, well then I guess I won't, try to hook you up with my best female friend.
Yeah.
And we have remained friends to this day.
Ah, good. Well, having the conversations is difficult, and really, I would say you need to look for some grace in finding the occasion when you can talk about things. People don't talk about sex, right? I mean, I was kidding about this last night when I said we're Methodists. We don't talk about sex, really. I mean, but we haven't really. It's not the sort of thing that's comfortable and so forth. So. And it really, my own experience, I explained to you, was just of having students come to me and say, I'm a Baptist, and well, here's another example. I'm a Baptist, and when she heard me describing the early monks, and she said, that's what Jesus has called me to do. And it's not about being gay or something. It's just, whoa, you're a Baptist. You're not supposed to say stuff like that. And she found a religious community where she could be a part of it and so forth. Yeah.
I grew up in the generation that there was no one openly gay, but as adults, we look back, there were gays among us all
Yes.
along. So I really did, and I had always, I'd always had like gay men as friends, and so it wasn't that I thought I was prejudiced, but when I moved to my current neighborhood, my next door neighbors were a female couple. And they were all worried because they knew that I went to church and whatever, and but I've never really experienced two people, being gay, living as a couple. And I think I love them dearly. It's like, but it opened my eyes to something that I had just really never, ever given it a moment's thought.
Yeah.
And it's been a real blessing because we all love
You
each
got to have
other,
that
and
conversation.
we had conversation.
Yeah.
And they told me how worried they were when they had a single black woman that was really religious moving in.
Okay, really? What? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Jeff, one of my first experiences was at Duke Divinity School, where I had a student, and I didn't know he was gay, but he came to my office and he said, I want to do a independent study in church history. I said, great, let's do independent study. And he says, I want to study about gay people in church history. And I said, sorry, I don't know anything about that. Sort of like your initial response. And what we came to was he's going to teach me this semester. And he found the literature and brought it to me and sort of became my teacher.
Did the churches that chose to disaffiliate necessarily all go to the global?
No, not at all. In fact, the Global Methodist Church was the largest number of disaffiliating churches, but number one, many of them became independent, especially larger churches like in this area, St. Andrews and Whitechapel, those kind of congregations, and they tended to say this really isn't much about the gay issue. They'd been wanting to be more independent kind of all along the way, so that happened. But also there are other denominations like Free Methodist Church, Wesleyan Methodist Church, all kinds of Methodist groups out there. Some of them don't even have the name Methodist, like Church of the Nazarene is actually a Methodist-related denomination that originated about 45 miles north of here, and really now part of it's the third largest Wesleyan church in the United States now. It's a very important church. But no, there have been disaffiliations that went all kinds of different ways. So, yeah. Thank you all very much for putting up with this topic. Tomorrow night, we're not going to talk about sex, actually, just a little bit, but it's going to be a different topic. Thank you.
And as I look out on the congregation, I see that pretty much everyone is still breathing. So
okay.
we have survived.
Yeah.
Ted, thank you for leading us through a complicated conversation.
It is a complicated story.
And in a very sensitive and pastoral way. And this is what I was alluding to last night when I told you about why I like Ted so much. Because he does responsible historical scholarship and always with a pastor's heart. So thank you, Ted, for that. We'll look forward to tomorrow night. So our friends Caleb and Balky are here from Union Coffee.
Hey.
They have brought their coffee, and it includes decaf.
Yeah.
So if anyone was concerned, they heard our cry and brought decaf. So we're going to... I'm sorry?
Can I have a pod with a regular?
Oh, yes.
You know
There is regular as well. Yeah, fear not.